The king's ransom, an unfathomable sum of 3,000,000 gold écus, could not purchase the weight of his iron crown, which now lay tarnished in the mud of a foreign field, nor the lives of the 1,000 noblemen who had died to save the gilded prison he now inhabited. This was John II, the most Christian king of France, captive of a 26-year-old English prince. The air was thick with the reek of defeat, a sour, metallic odor of dried blood and stale fear that clung to the velvet hangings of the captured king's tent. Beyond the canvas walls, the remnants of the French army, a host assembled with the finest chivalry of Christendom, were being systematically stripped, their armor piled like grotesque silver incept shells. John II, King of France, known to history as the Good, sat across a rough-hewn table from his conqueror, Edward, Prince of Wales, known by the terrifying moniker of the Black Prince. John's dignity was a heavy, embroidered garment he wore despite the catastrophic ruin of the Battle of Poitiers. He was a man of magnificent beard and imposing presence, but his eyes held the haunted, vacant look of a patriarch who had just seen his entire lineage consumed by a sudden storm. His defeat was not just a military disaster, it was a profound spiritual humiliation. The French belief in their ordained superiority, their divine right to victory, had been ripped away by the English longbows which delivered death indiscriminately to the noblest and the lowliest alike. "Your grace is afforded every courtesy," the Black Prince said, his voice an odd blend of formal deference and cold, steel-edged superiority. He stood near the table, not seated, a subtle, calculated psychological tactic. The prince was a figure of unsettling grace, his armor famously blackened, giving him an almost demonic silhouette against the faint torchlight. "Your chambers in Bordeaux are prepared, and when we cross the sea, the Tower of London awaits, a structure worthy of a king, though perhaps not the circumstances of his residence." John merely dipped his chin, a movement heavy with resignation. "Your courtesy of an executioner is still a courtesy, Prince. You have secured your name in history, and you have condemned mine to infamy." The true weight of the disaster was not merely the king's capture, but the absence of his two most critical sons. The youngest, Philip the Bold, had fought valiantly by his father's side, earning his sobriquet for bravery, and was now a fellow prisoner. But the heir, Charles, the Dauphin, Duke of Normandy, had been convinced, some might say ordered, to flee the field before the final rout. Charles, a wiry, pale youth of 18, with the large, intelligent eyes of an observer rather than a warrior, was now the only pillar left standing. He was currently riding hell for leather toward Paris, the capital where he was not loved and where the populace was already simmering with revolutionary rage. Paris, the heart of the kingdom, was now a powder keg. Meanwhile, in the king's temporary tent prison, a lone French man-at-arms, a grizzled veteran named Guillaume, polished the king's sword, pretending not to listen to the fatal negotiations. He represented the common, peasant backbone of France, a resource the Valois Dynasty had consistently undervalued in favor of their reckless armored cavalry. "The Estates General will meet," John stated, his eyes locking onto the prince's. "France will not abandon her king." The prince smiled, a thin, unnerving gesture. "France is bankrupt, your grace. The coin of the realm is hatred and internal strife. Your cousin, Charles the Bad of Navarre, schemes from behind his walls. The mercenary companies, the routiers, are loose and consuming the countryside. And your own people, King John, cry death to the taxes before they cry God save the king." This was the core tragedy of the Valois dynasty. They had inherited a kingdom already exhausted by war, poor administration, and the creeping dread of the Black Death. King John, for all his personal honor, was a medieval relic, believing in the code of chivalry as a viable strategy. His heir, Charles, the boy now fleeing the field, was something else entirely. He was the first modern Valois, a cynic, an intellectual, a strategist who valued gold and diplomacy over glory and blood. As the sun set on the English-held camp, painting the sky a desolate blood-orange hue. John II sat alone, a king awaiting passage to a foreign cage. His son Philippe was brought in, his face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. "Father," Philippe whispered, kneeling before the table, "I regret only that I could not persuade the Dauphin to stay. His departure, it looks like cowardice." John looked at the boy, then at the empty space where the Dauphin Charles should have been. He thought of his eldest son, a boy who rarely smiled, who pored over legal texts and was famously mocked by the nobles for his sickly constitution and avoidance of the joust. "No, Philippe," John said, his voice a gravelly murmur. "It looks like survival. The Dauphin is the seed, and I am the sacrifice. He is to be a king who will not ride. He is to be a king who thinks." A guard's boot fell outside the tent. The prince's voice was heard giving an order. The king was to be moved before dawn. John II stood, allowing Guillaume to place his heavy surcoat about his shoulders. He looked one last time at the camp, at the chaotic, triumphant noise of the English, and the silent, overwhelming evidence of the French catastrophe. The fate of the Valois Dynasty, the very existence of France, had just been placed upon the narrow, frail shoulders of the boy who had run away. Charles, the Dauphin, now regent of a realm in ruin, was about to face the Estates General. He knew that the hardest battle was not with the English on a field, but with his own people, in the echoing halls of a Parisian parliament, and that battle would begin the moment he arrived. The golden cage of his father was a horror, but the crown awaiting Charles was a crown of crimson thorns, forged in the fires of civil war and popular rebellion. He spurred his horse onward toward the looming shadow of the capital, already planning the cold, calculating moves that John II would never have made. The old world had died at Poitiers. The new, terrifying age of the Valois was about to begin.
The smoke of Parisian dissent was thicker and far more acrid than the gunpowder haze of Poitiers. When the Dauphin Charles, newly appointed regent of a ruined realm, rode into the capital, he did not find solace. He found a city vibrating with cold, organized fury. The streets, which should have been cheering the king's son, were instead lined with hostile, silent faces. The common people, merchants, artisans, and laborers, decked in the revolutionary colors of the moment, the blue and red of Paris. The man who orchestrated this chilling reception, who had seized the power vacuum left by King John II's capture, was Étienne Marcel, the provost of the merchants. Marcel was no peasant firebrand. He was a wealthy clothier and a formidable orator, the elected leader of the city's guilds and the embodiment of a new, terrifying political force, the empowered burgher class. He believed the Valois dynasty had failed utterly, squandering the nation's wealth and blood through aristocratic incompetence. Marcel had been the driving force behind the recently convened Estates General, France's advisory parliament, which he had successfully turned into a governing body, usurping royal authority while the king sat captive in England. Charles established himself in the Louvre, a fortress that felt suddenly very small and very vulnerable. His counselors, the few who had not been killed or captured at Poitiers, were veterans of diplomacy and law, but they were paralyzed by the sheer audacity of Marcel's demands. "The Estates General demands, sire," the chancellor stammered, his eyes wide with fear, "the removal of 22 royal officials, anyone they deem corrupt or incompetent. They demand the right to appoint their own council to oversee all royal taxes and expenditure. They call this the Great Ordinance. It is nothing less than the transfer of the crown's power to the people's representatives." Charles, still pale and slight, sat rigid in his high-backed chair. He was only 20, forced to contend with national bankruptcy, mercenary armies, and now a sophisticated civilian coup. He was not a natural warrior like his father, but he possessed a deep, ruthless intelligence. He listened to the demands, weighing them not in terms of offense to his dignity, but as strategic obstacles. "They do not ask, they dictate," Charles observed, his voice calm, a low drone in the echoing hall. "And their figurehead, Marcel, has ensured that the streets support their dictation. If I refuse the ordinance, the streets will run with blood, and I will be the first casualty. If I sign it, I become a puppet of a tailor." His initial tactic was evasion. Charles stalled, pleading the complexity of the demands and the need for his father's counsel. He tried to raise money through the currency, a devaluation that enraged the merchants, Marcel's core constituency, who saw their wealth vanish overnight. Marcel's response was swift and decisive. He had already established a militia, a citizen army wearing his blue and red colors. In February 1358, he led them along with 300 armed men to the Palais de la Cité, where the Dauphin resided. Charles woke to the sound of pounding feet and shouting. He dressed quickly, the silence of his personal guard more terrifying than any noise. When Marcel and his mob burst into the chamber, they found the Dauphin standing his ground. "We are here for justice, Dauphin," Marcel roared, his merchant's robe now covered by a light armor vest, the blue and red hood giving him the look of a vengeful tribune. Marcel pointed. His men seized the two marshals of Champagne and Normandy, close personal advisors to Charles, who had only hours before been speaking with the Dauphin. The marshals were dragged, screaming, into the center of the room. The massacre that followed was meant to be a visceral, shocking lesson. Before Charles's horrified eyes, the marshals were hacked to death, their blood staining the royal chamber's tapestry and even splashing the Dauphin's tunic. The sheer brutality of the act, the murder of high-ranking royal officials in the heir's own presence, was a profound defilement of the crown's sanctity. Marcel, standing over the twitching bodies, approached the rigid, silent Charles. He removed his own blue and red Parisian hood and placed it firmly on the Dauphin's head, an act of supreme symbolic dominance. "Fear not, sire," Marcel said, his face slick with sweat and zeal. "You are saved by this insignia. Be the leader of your city, not the betrayer of your people." This moment was the forging of Charles V the Wise. The weak, sickly boy who ran from Poitiers vanished. The man who remained was a sovereign who had witnessed the terrifying reality of popular power, internal rebellion, and the utter failure of noble chivalry. He learned the value of patience, political maneuvering, and above all, the imperative of crushing dissent with overwhelming, unsentimental force. He now understood that the true enemy was not just across the Channel, but often within his own walls. Charles played the part. He donned the Parisian colors and even publicly praised Marcel's vigilance, but his every thought was now focused on escape and retribution. Marcel had made the Dauphin a hostage, but he had also provided him with an education in power that no royal tutor ever could. A few days later, using the pretense of touring the provinces to negotiate aid, Charles slipped out of Paris. The air of the city, once a symbol of his inheritance, now felt like a suffocating tomb. He rode eastward towards the city of Compiègne. From exile, Charles marshaled his loyalists and the remnants of the nobility. He declared Marcel a traitor, annulled the Great Ordinance, and began a quiet, calculated war against his own capital. The city was isolated, its supply lines cut by royal forces and the roving bands of routiers, unemployed mercenaries whose depredations Marcel could not control. The Étienne Marcel Inferno wasn't just the coup, it was the chaos that followed. Marcel, in his desperation, sought an alliance with the most treacherous figure in France, Charles the Bad, King of Navarre. But his alliance with a universally distrusted, scheming foreign prince alienated the Parisian bourgeoisie he depended on. Marcel's revolution, founded on principles of popular reform, was consumed by its own overreach and the Dauphin's cold-blooded strategy.
Sensing the tide turning, a faction of the Parisian merchant class, fearing Marcel's extremism and its economic consequences, seized the opportunity. On the night of July 31st, 1358, as Marcel attempted to take full control of the city gates, he was ambushed and hacked to death by a group of his former allies. The Dauphin Charles rode back into Paris in triumph, but not with the jubilant cheers of a returning hero. He returned with an implacable purpose. He showed mercy to some, but ruthlessly executed the ringleaders of Marcel's revolt. The crisis of the Étienne Marcel Inferno ended not with a noble charge, but with a calculated political assassination and a swift consolidation of power. Charles V had learned that a king must rule not by chivalry, but by fear and shrewd administration. The golden cage of his father was a horror, but the crown he now wore was one he had reclaimed through political ruthlessness. The kingdom was still shattered, but its head, the Dauphin, was transformed from a boy into the first truly wise Valois king. He was now ready for the next phase, dealing with the actual English enemy and the humiliating treaty that was about to be signed to free his father. The year 1360 was not a year of battle, but a year of surrender. While the Dauphin Charles had brutally suppressed the chaos in Paris, reclaiming his authority from the burghers and securing his position as regent, the English still held the ultimate bargaining chip, King John II. The cost of the king's chivalric folly at Poitiers was now being tabulated in a Parisian monastery, far from the battlefield, a ledger of national humiliation. Charles, now the de facto ruler, was forced to confront his father's captor, Edward the Black Prince, not with swords, but with ink and parchment. The negotiations culminated in the catastrophic Treaty of Brétigny. The Dauphin's small, windowless chamber in the Louvre was crowded not with warriors, but with somber-faced clerks and weary diplomats. Charles, never comfortable in the presence of noise or excessive emotion, oversaw the reading of the final terms. Item 1, the lead diplomat read, his voice flat with despair. The King of England, Edward III, renounces his claim to the throne of France. A collective sigh of relief filled the room, a brief illusion of victory. However, the diplomat continued, his voice dropping, in exchange for this renunciation, the King of France cedes, in full sovereignty, the provinces of Aquitaine, including Poitou, Saintonge, Angoumois, and Limousin, and the entirety of Calais and Ponthieu, 1/3 of the kingdom, sire, permanently. The room fell silent. To give up territory was one thing. To surrender sovereignty was to concede the core identity of France. The Dauphin stared at the map laid across the table, watching the vast swaths of yellow and red, the colors of the English, creep inland, slicing the kingdom in half. The loss was more than territorial. It was a psychological maiming of the Valois realm. But the ransom was the true staggering blow. Item 2, the diplomat whispered. For the release of His Majesty, King John II, a ransom of 3 million gold écus is required, the equivalent of nearly 4 years of the kingdom's projected revenue. 10 hostages, including royal princes and the highest noblemen, must be surrendered to England to guarantee the payments. Charles's thin lips pressed into a tight white line. He had learned in the Étienne Marcel Inferno that honor was a liability, and that survival demanded ruthlessness. He knew instinctively that France could not, perhaps should not, pay the full ransom. It would cripple the kingdom for generations, leaving no coin for the rebuilding of its army or the repair of its administration. "We have no choice," Charles finally stated, his voice devoid of emotion, a tone that startled his counselors. "The king must be freed. The terms are accepted. Draw up the final charters." His agreement was a calculated risk. He viewed the treaty not as a peace, but as a temporary, necessary truce.
He resolved that the clauses concerning territorial cession and sovereignty would be voided the moment France was strong enough to break them. The arrival of King John II back on French soil was supposed to be a joyous occasion, a display of national unity. Instead, it was a strangely muted event. The king, after 4 years in comfortable, even opulent captivity in England, where he had been treated more as an honored, high-value guest than a prisoner, returned a figure of outdated chivalry. He spoke of his bond with King Edward III, praised the generosity of the English court, and seemed disconnected from the visceral suffering of his kingdom. The contrast with his son was striking. Charles, the pale, serious intellectual, looked 10 years older than his age, his mind etched with the scars of rebellion and bankruptcy. John, the grand warrior, looked healthier than when he had left, but his worldview was still mired in the doomed code of Poitiers. King John II attempted to govern, but his efforts were disastrously impractical. The first installment of the ransom was paid, but raising the rest proved almost impossible. France was being devoured by the roving mercenary companies, the routiers, disbanded after the treaty, who recognized no authority and lived purely by pillage. They were the Black Prince's shadow, a phantom army consuming the provinces ceded by the treaty and those still claimed by the Valois alike. John's inability to govern, combined with the crushing financial burden, led to a bizarre, final act of medieval honor. One of the high-ranking royal hostages sent to England to guarantee the ransom, the Duke of Anjou, escaped his English captivity. King John II, appalled by this breach of chivalric honor, made a decision that baffled his son and the entire realm. "My honor is stained," John announced to his council. "The King of France gave his word. My son's dishonor is my dishonor. I must return to London to submit to King Edward's will." Charles argued vehemently against it. "Your Majesty, France cannot afford the ransom. Your place is here to rebuild the kingdom, not to return to an unnecessary prison based on a point of honor that means nothing to our enemies." But John was resolute. His medieval code demanded personal atonement. He saw his return as a grand, final, honorable gesture. In 1364, King John II sailed back to England, where he died a few months later, still a captive, still owing the ransom. His self-imposed exile and subsequent death completed the tragedy of his reign. He had paid the ultimate price for his defeat, leaving his son a poisoned, fractured inheritance. The moment of John II's death was the moment of Charles V's ascension. The Dauphin, the boy who had fled the field, the regent who had been held hostage in his own palace, was finally king. His reign began not with celebration, but with the chilling reality that he was king of a bankrupt, fractional state, with a massive foreign army stationed permanently on French soil and a crushing debt that was still due. Charles V, henceforth known as the Wise, turned the full force of his calculating, patient intellect towards a single goal, the complete military and economic reversal of the Treaty of Brétigny. He dismissed the notions of glorious battles and chivalric codes. His war would be waged with treachery, diplomacy, engineering, and most importantly, the systematic employment of strategic avoidance. The lesson of Poitiers, Marcel, and Brétigny was indelible. The Valois could only survive if they became smarter, not braver. The shadows of the Black Prince and the ransomed king were finally lifted, and the wise king was free to begin his long game.
The reign of Charles V, the Wise, proved to be the brief, shining recovery the Valois Dynasty desperately needed. Through his methodical genius, his emphasis on finance, his rebuilding of the French army under capable commanders like Bertrand du Guesclin, and his strategy of avoiding direct pitched battle, he successfully reversed the losses of Brétigny. By 1378, the English presence in France was reduced to only Calais, Bordeaux, and Bayonne. France was financially stable, its borders secured, and its king respected. Charles V had earned his epithet. Yet, even wisdom could not defeat mortality. In September 1380, at the age of only 42, King Charles V died suddenly. His death, likely hastened by a recurrent illness, was the single most disastrous event for the Valois dynasty since Poitiers. It instantly plunged the meticulously rebuilt kingdom back into anarchy, driven not by foreign invasion, but by the poisonous ambition of his own blood. The heir to the throne was Charles VI, a boy of just 11 years old. The solemn ritual of the Regency Council began almost before the king's body was cold. The late king's testament had explicitly decreed a careful plan for his son's minority, placing authority primarily in the hands of the queen and the most trusted royal counselors, ensuring a smooth continuation of his policies. However, three figures stood in the way of this prudent transfer of power: the powerful and rapacious uncles of the young king. These were the late king's brothers, Louis, Duke of Anjou, the oldest, who saw himself as the principal heir to power; John, Duke of Berry, obsessed with art, luxury, and accumulating wealth; and Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, the most influential, thanks to his vast Flemish and Burgundian territories. They met in the royal chambers, their luxurious clothes rustling as they argued over the body of their deceased brother's authority. The uncles, particularly Anjou and Burgundy, had no intention of respecting the deceased king's carefully laid out plans. They were consumed by a singular, overriding goal: to seize control of the boy king, and through him, the immense royal treasury Charles V had painstakingly accumulated. "My deceased brother entrusted the care of his soul to God, and the care of his temporal authority to his eldest remaining brother," asserted Louis of Anjou, his voice booming with false piety. Anjou was a man of magnificent greed, currently obsessed with pressing his claim to the throne of Naples, a venture that would require unimaginable sums of money. Philip the Bold, shrewd and patient, countered, "The well-being of the realm requires stable, experienced hands, brother, hands that can govern the high nobility. The treasury is a responsibility, not a prize." This was a lie. Burgundy coveted the royal wealth to consolidate his own burgeoning territorial state along the eastern border of France. Within days, the uncles dismissed Charles V's loyal council, forcing them out of power through intimidation and threats. They seized the young Charles VI, and with him the keys to the royal treasury. The sight of the boy king, Charles VI, at his coronation was a study in profound vulnerability. Small and bewildered in the heavy robes of state, he was a silent symbol of a kingdom ripe for plunder. The crown placed upon his head was immediately used by his uncles as a mask for their avarice. The Duke of Anjou struck first. He demanded the staggering sum of 1,000,000 gold francs from the treasury to fund his Neapolitan adventure. This money, meant to sustain the war effort and support the kingdom, was instead poured into a distant, ill-fated Italian campaign that ultimately failed and consumed much of Charles V's savings. The sudden and egregious spending by the regents immediately necessitated new, heavy taxes. The merchants and common people, who had suffered under the old regimes and supported Charles V's fiscal prudence, revolted. In Paris, the Maillotins revolt exploded, named for the heavy lead mallets the angry mob used as weapons. Charles VI, still a child, was forced to ride at the head of a hastily assembled royal army to suppress the rebellion in his own capital. The ensuing crackdown was brutal and decisive, showing the Valois' capacity for crushing internal dissent, but it confirmed that the goodwill built by Charles V had been rapidly squandered by his brothers. This era of the Regency was the poisoned succession. It was not merely bad government, it was a period of systemic internal bleeding.
The uncles used their control of the young king to enrich themselves, fight their personal wars, and consolidate their regional power bases, all at the expense of the national government. The powerful dukes of Burgundy, Anjou, and Berry essentially acted as independent princes, dismantling the centralized authority Charles V had spent 2 decades establishing. When the young Charles VI finally achieved majority at the age of 20 and dismissed his grasping uncles, he was initially hailed as a savior. He reinstated his father's old, trusted counselors, known as the marmozets, and began to govern justly, even capably. However, the damage had been done, and the stress of the regency, the constant political pressure, the forced ride against his own citizens, the witness to endless court scheming, had taken a catastrophic toll on the young king's psyche. The true poison of the succession manifested in 1392 during a campaign against the Duke of Brittany. While riding through a forest on a scorching summer day, a ragged peasant leaped out and seized the king's bridle. Though the guards quickly subdued the man, the shock was enough to break the young king's mind. He began to strike at his own men, screaming that he was betrayed. He had to be restrained and carried back to Paris. His reign was instantly plunged back into crisis. From that point on, Charles VI would suffer from recurring, debilitating bouts of insanity, during which he believed he was St. George, a commoner, or even made of glass. The king's madness created an absolute power vacuum that the royal uncles immediately filled once again. But a new, younger figure had emerged to challenge them, Louis, Duke of Orleans, the king's younger and equally ambitious brother. The stage was now set for the final mortal stage of the Valois catastrophe. The theft of the treasury and the mental collapse of the king, both caused by the regency, led directly to the formation of 2 warring, irreconcilable factions, the Burgundians and the Armagnacs, or Orleanists. The House of Valois was no longer fighting the English. It was about to begin a brutal, self-destructive civil war, providing the perfect, fatal opportunity for the enemy to return. The poisoned succession was complete. The great tragedy of Agincourt was waiting, inevitable, in the wings.
The chaos that followed Charles VI's descent into madness was more insidious than a foreign invasion. It was a slow internal rot fueled by unchecked ambition. With the king oscillating between periods of lucidity and terrifying fits of delusion, believing himself to be made of glass or howling like a wolf, the power of the Valois crown became a prize fought over by 2 powerful, incompatible forces. This was the birth of the Burgundian and Armagnac factions, a rivalry that would plunge France into a civil war more devastating than the conflict with England had ever been. The 2 antagonists were the king's most powerful male relatives. John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, the son of Philip the Bold, he inherited a vast, wealthy domain stretching from the Low Countries to the eastern borders of France. Burgundy was politically astute, ruthlessly pragmatic, and viewed the control of France as essential for the security and expansion of his own territorial state. He courted the common people of Paris, positioning himself as the protector of the burghers against royal excess. Louis, Duke of Orleans, the king's younger brother, Louis was handsome, cultured, and scandalously extravagant. He was the most direct threat to Burgundy's power, using his close proximity to the queen, Isabeau de Bavaria, to influence the royal council and control access to the moments of the king's lucidity. The faction supporting him became known as the Armagnacs, named later for a powerful southern ally, Bernard VII, Count of Armagnac. The conflict was fought not on open fields but in the echoing halls of the royal residence, the Hôtel Saint-Paul, where the sick king drifted in and out of reality. It was a cold war of court manipulation, tax policy, and patronage. Louis of Orleans, controlling the treasury, levied high taxes to fund his personal ambitions and maintain the court's splendor. John the Fearless, playing the populist,
vociferously opposed these taxes, making him a hero to the Parisian populace, the tension became a physical entity, a dark presence in the court. The two dukes, Burgundy and Orléans, barely concealed their hatred, exchanging venomous accusations and nearly coming to blows in front of the king during his brief moments of sanity. In November 1407, after a period of escalating political brinksmanship, the two dukes seemingly reconciled. They swore a public oath of friendship and mutual aid, shaking hands before the high altar of the Augustinian convent. The fragile peace lasted for 3 days. On the evening of November 23, 1407, Louis of Orléans left the Hôtel Barbette, where he had been visiting Queen Isabeau, who was rumored to be his lover, and headed back to his residence. He was accompanied by a small mounted retinue, enjoying the quiet of the Parisian night. As his party passed through the narrow, dark Rue Vieille du Temple, they were ambushed by a group of masked assassins lying in wait. The attack was swift, professional, and merciless. Orléans, dragged from his mule, cried out, "I am the Duke of Orléans." The leader of the ambush, a Picardine knight in the pay of Burgundy named Raoulette d'Anqueton, responded with chilling finality, "It is you we seek." Louis of Orléans was hacked to death in the street. His hand was severed as he tried to defend himself, his skull split open with an axe, and his men slain trying to protect him. The news electrified Paris. It was the first royal assassination in French history. A calculated, political murder ordered by a prince of the blood against the king's own brother. This was not the chaotic bloodletting of the Étienne Marcel Revolt. This was a deliberate act of fratricide orchestrated by one of the kingdom's most powerful men. It shattered the last vestiges of trust and chivalry among the nobility. John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, initially feigned shock and grief, even serving as a pallbearer at the Duke's lavish funeral. But the public suspicions, particularly among the Armagnac allies, quickly focused on him. Fearing arrest, John fled Paris. However, his cunning was revealed when, rather than hiding, he returned just a few months later with a massive armed escort. He demanded and received a public audience with the demented King Charles VI. During this audience, John the Fearless employed a brilliant and cynical piece of political theater. He hired a Sorbonne theologian, John Petit, to deliver a meticulously prepared 4-hour-long public justification for the murder. The speech, known as the Justification, argued that Louis of Orléans was a tyrannical, morally corrupt traitor who had plotted to usurp the throne, poison the king, and engage in witchcraft. John the Fearless, the theologian asserted, had merely performed a tyrannicide, an act of public good. The king, in a moment of lucidity manipulated by Burgundy's partisans, formally pardoned John the Fearless. The official pardon did not end the matter, it merely institutionalized the hatred. The children of the murdered Duke of Orléans, led by his son Charles, a future poet-prince, refused to accept the ruling. They and their powerful allies, like the Count of Armagnac, swore a blood oath of vengeance against the House of Burgundy. The assassination of Orléans created an unbridgeable chasm, dividing the Valois court and the French nobility into two irreconcilable armies. The Burgundians, who commanded the majority of Paris and the rich northern territories, the Armagnacs, who controlled the young Dauphin, the south, and the apparatus of the official royal government. The two factions immediately began to arm, fighting small, vicious engagements across the countryside, destroying farmland and disrupting trade. The final, fatal consequence of this civil war was that it completely paralyzed France's ability to defend itself. When the new, ambitious King of England, Henry V, surveyed the French political landscape, he did not see a unified enemy. He saw a fractured, cannibalizing kingdom ruled by a mad king and two dukes obsessed with fratricide. Henry V calculated correctly that this was the moment to reclaim the old Plantagenet claims. a moment when French chivalry was too busy killing itself to defend its borders. The two factions had inadvertently extended a bloody, open invitation to the English enemy, clearing the path for the disaster that awaited them at a muddy field in the north. The stage was set for the ultimate reckoning.
The internal French war between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions had consumed the nation's attention, treasury, and honor. While the princes of the blood were locked in a cycle of assassination and civil strife, they failed to notice the cold, calculating intelligence now sitting on the English throne, Henry V. Young, pious, and intensely ambitious, Henry V was the antithesis of the aging, decadent Valois court. He saw the French Civil War not as a deterrent, but as an open invitation. In the summer of 1415, Henry V landed his army on the coast of Normandy and quickly besieged the port of Harfleur. The French, divided and slow to react, finally mobilized a massive royal army, comprised almost entirely of Armagnac loyalists. The Dauphin and the Armagnac Council had effectively barred the powerful Burgundians from participating, trusting them even less than they trusted the English. The French objective was not to stop Henry V's advance, but to trap his plague-ridden, exhausted army as it marched toward the safety of the English-held port of Calais. The Armagnac leadership, obsessed with the traditional French chivalric code, felt certain of victory through sheer numerical superiority. They yearned for a glorious, redeeming victory that would erase the shame of Poitiers. The two armies finally converged near the village of Agincourt on October 25, 1415, the feast day of Saint Crispin. The battlefield was a newly plowed, narrow strip of land flanked by thick woods, recently soaked by days of relentless rain. The ground was already churned into a heavy, suffocating mud, a fact that the French commanders, confident in their heavy cavalry, fatally ignored. The French deployed their army in three massive, dense ranks, primarily composed of the highest nobility, princes, dukes, counts, and thousands of knights, arrayed in magnificent, newly forged plate armor. Their collective weight was intended to crush the English, but the narrowness of the field and the deep mud immediately became liabilities. Henry V, meanwhile, addressed his vastly outnumbered, exhausted, and hungry English forces. His army was mostly composed of lightly armored infantry and, critically, thousands of highly trained longbowmen. He positioned the bowmen on the flanks, protected by concealed stakes driven into the mud. The French attack was a disaster from the start. The first rank, driven forward by the mass of men behind them and weighted down by their expensive, heavy armor, immediately bogged down in the deep clay mud. Their charge became a slow, frantic slog. When the French knights were within range, the English longbows unleashed a terrifying, continuous hail of arrows. The arrows piercing the weaker joints and visors of the armor turned the advance into a slaughter. The knights who managed to reach the English line were so exhausted from fighting the mud that they were easily cut down by the nimble English infantry. The carnage was appalling. As the second and third French ranks pressed forward, the dead and wounded from the first rank piled up, creating an obstacle the size of a low wall. The knights, trapped, slipped, and fell into the deep mud, where their own armor became an iron coffin, suffocating or drowning them. The final, decisive atrocity of the battle occurred when Henry V, fearing a French counterattack or the freeing of his many prisoners, gave a horrifying, desperate order: massacre the captives. French prisoners, many of the highest, wealthiest noblemen of France, were summarily executed by the English foot soldiers. The battle lasted only a few hours. The results were catastrophic for the Valois. The list of the dead was a genealogical record of the French aristocracy. 3 dukes, 5 counts, and over 90 barons perished. Most tragically, the commanders of the Armagnac faction were killed, including the Duke of Alençon and the Constable of France. Crucially, 3 princes of the blood were captured, including Charles, the Duke of Orleans,
the son of the murdered Louis of Orleans and leader of the Armagnac faction, who would spend the next 25 years as a prisoner in England, ironically saved from the immediate carnage of the French Civil War he had sworn to avenge. The Valois had lost the flower of their military nobility. The disaster of Agincourt was worse than Poitiers, because the English were now positioned not merely to win a ransom, but to conquer the country outright. The defeat had immediate and profound political consequences in Paris. Elimination of the Armagnac leadership, the battlefield cleared out the main opposition to John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. He was now the undisputed most powerful man in France. Psychological collapse. The defeat broke the will of the court and shattered what little sanity remained in King Charles VI. The Valois lost all credibility as protectors of France. Burgundian seizure of Paris. 2 years later, in 1418, John the Fearless marched his forces into a waiting pro-Burgundian Paris. The Armagnacs were purged in a new wave of massacres, and Burgundy seized full control of the king, the queen, and the entire royal administration. The young Dauphin, Charles, the future Charles VII, barely escaped the Burgundian takeover of Paris, fleeing south with a handful of loyalists to the territory beyond the Loire River. Agincourt was not just a military defeat, it was the death of Valois chivalry. It proved the absolute supremacy of modern strategic military tactics over outdated aristocratic honor. It stripped the Valois of their nobility, broke their central government, and left the kingdom wide open for foreign domination. For the Dauphin Charles, who now sat shivering in the south, disinherited and dispossessed, the shadow of the Black Prince was replaced by the imminent threat of Henry V, who was already planning his final conquest.
The defeat at Agincourt and the subsequent Burgundian seizure of Paris created the perfect storm for the King of England, Henry V. He was no longer fighting for ransom or territory, he was fighting for the crown of France. The Valois kingdom was split into 3 hostile entities: the English invaders, the powerful Burgundian faction controlling Paris and the insane King Charles VI, and the dispossessed Armagnac faction huddled around the young Dauphin Charles south of the Loire. The Civil War raged with renewed brutality. The Dauphin Charles, still a teenager, desperate to reclaim his rightful place, allowed himself to be manipulated into a catastrophic act of political violence that played directly into Henry V's hands. In September 1419, the Dauphin and John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, agreed to meet on the bridge at Montereau for a final negotiation intended to forge an alliance against the English. It was meant to be a moment of reconciliation, mirroring the oath taken by Orleans and Burgundy years prior. The meeting was a carefully staged trap. As John the Fearless knelt before the Dauphin, seeking a peaceful resolution, the young Dauphin's men, Armagnac loyalists, still seeking revenge for the 1407 murder of Louis of Orleans, slammed down the protective barrier. They surrounded the Duke and, ignoring his pleas for parley, brutally assassinated him on the bridge in front of the horrified Dauphin. The murder of John the Fearless was a catastrophic error of judgment. The Dauphin had sought to eliminate a dangerous rival, but he instead pushed the enormous, wealthy, and strategically vital House of Burgundy entirely into the arms of the English king. The new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, was consumed by a desire for vengeance against the Dauphin Charles, whom he viewed as the chief orchestrator of his father's murder. Philip the Good immediately allied himself with Henry V, transforming the war from a national struggle into a family vendetta. The alliance resulted in the ultimate humiliation for the Valois Dynasty, the Treaty of Troyes. The signing of the treaty took place in May 1420. The key players were Henry V of England, the enraged Philip the Good of Burgundy, and the malleable Queen Isabel of Bavaria, who had taken full control of the lunatic King Charles VI. Queen Isabel, known for her political ruthlessness and perhaps motivated by fear or hatred of her own son, the Dauphin Charles, was the architect of the betrayal. The treaty's terms were staggering, effectively ending the Valois line and giving France to the Plantagenets. Disinheritance of the Dauphin,
The treaty declared the young Dauphin Charles illegitimate, disinheriting him entirely from the French throne. English heir, it recognized Henry V of England as the only rightful heir to the French throne upon the death of Charles VI. Marriage. Henry V was to immediately marry Catherine of Valois, the daughter of Charles VI, thereby uniting the two crowns in his person. Regent of France. Henry V was appointed Regent of France, taking full control of the kingdom's administration and defense. The treaty was ratified by the insane King Charles VI himself, whose fragile mind was manipulated by his queen and the Burgundian faction. The King of France had signed away his own son's birthright and the future of his dynasty to the enemy. The consequence was immediate. The French crown was split. The English and Burgundians now controlled Paris, Normandy, Picardy, and the northeast, the richest and most populous regions. Henry V reigned from the Louvre, recognized by much of the nobility and the Parisian populace. The Dauphin Charles, meanwhile, was reduced to calling himself the Dauphin of Viennois, or often simply the Bourge King, sneeringly named after the small city in the Valois-controlled territory of the south, since he governed little more than a handful of impoverished war-torn provinces. The Dauphin Charles lived in constant fear and suspicion in the south, isolated and with few allies. He was the disinherited, accused of murder, and officially declared a bastard by his own mother. He dared not show his face at his father's court, knowing he would be arrested or assassinated. The legitimate line of the House of Valois was at its absolute nadir, reduced to a desperate, poorly financed resistance movement. The Treaty of Troyes was supposed to signal the end of the 100 Years' War with a definitive English victory. However, history intervened swiftly. In a stunning reversal of fortune, both Henry V and the insane Charles VI died within 2 months of each other in 1422. The two crowns were now inherited by Henry VI, the infant son of Henry V and Catherine of Valois, who was proclaimed King of England and France in Paris. The Dauphin Charles, though disinherited, now faced a child king as his chief rival. At the age of 19, he was proclaimed King of France by his loyalists, though he was only crowned symbolically in the south. The true, deep significance of the Treaty of Troyes was its confirmation that the Valois dynasty's greatest enemy was itself. The civil war, the factional hatred, and the Dauphin's bloody act of revenge had created the political framework for the foreign occupation of France. The Dauphin Charles, the ultimate victim of the treaty, was now forced to fight not just for his country, but for the fundamental legitimacy of his own identity, a fight that seemed utterly hopeless in the face of the Anglo-Burgundian alliance. The last hope lay in a miracle, a divine intervention that could restore the morale that the politicians had destroyed.
The Treaty of Troyes had stripped the Dauphin Charles of his legitimacy, territory, and dignity. He was the Bourges' king, a mockery, ruling a splintered, impoverished territory south of the Loire, surrounded by deeply suspicious and pessimistic counselors. Since the dual deaths of Henry V and Charles VI, the Valois cause had been reduced to a grim defensive stalemate. The English, under the capable Duke of Bedford, had pushed relentlessly south, and in 1428 they laid siege to the city of Orléans, the last major stronghold blocking their path into the Dauphin's final territories. Orléans was not merely a city. It was the symbolic heart of the resistance. If it fell, the Dauphin would have no choice but to retreat further, perhaps into Spain or Scotland, signaling the definitive end of the Valois claim. The Dauphin Charles, paralyzed by the shame of his disinheritance and the memory of his faction's assassination of John the Fearless, could not raise the siege. He considered surrender, despairing of any hope. Into this atmosphere of utter defeatism and spiritual collapse stepped the impossible, a 16-year-old peasant girl named Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc. She arrived at the Dauphin's court in Chinon in February 1429, claiming to be sent by God to raise the siege of Orléans and lead Charles to his rightful coronation in Reims, the traditional site for French kings now deep in Burgundian territory. The Dauphin Charles, suspicious and deeply unchivalrous, decided to test her. When Jean was led into the great hall, Charles deliberately hid himself among his courtiers, placing another man on his throne. Without hesitation, Jean walked past the false king, went straight to Charles, and knelt. "Gentle Dauphin," she declared, her voice firm and ringing, "I tell thee from God that thou art the true heir of France and king's son, and I am sent to lead you to your crowning at Rheims." Her certainty and the private revelation she reportedly shared with him, which allegedly confirmed her divine mission and eased his self-doubt about his legitimacy, convinced the superstitious Charles. But the court establishment remained skeptical. They subjected Jeanne to weeks of rigorous theological examination to ensure she was not a heretic or a madwoman. The sheer desperation of the situation, the imminent fall of Orléans, forced the Armagnacs to accept the unacceptable, to stake their entire cause on the faith of an illiterate farm girl. Jeanne, clad in white armor, carrying a banner emblazoned with the fleur-de-lis, was given command of a resupply convoy heading to the besieged city. She injected an electrifying moral certainty into the French troops. The soldiers, weary of fighting a political war, were suddenly fighting a holy war, a struggle for God's will against the English heretics and their Burgundian allies. Her arrival at Orléans in April 1429 immediately shifted the siege's psychological balance. The English troops, who had successfully beaten the best of French chivalry, were terrified by the sudden appearance of a figure they genuinely believed was a demonic sorceress. Jeanne did not rely on long-term strategy. She relied on momentum and belief. Within 9 days, through a series of bold, religiously charged assaults, the French army, galvanized by her presence and convinced of divine protection, succeeded in pushing the English from their fortified siege works. The siege was lifted in May 1429. The Maid of Orléans had achieved the impossible. The relief of Orléans was the powerful midpoint reversal of the entire conflict. It did not defeat the English army outright, but it irrevocably shattered the English claim of divine favor and broke the years of French defeatism. The Dauphin Charles was suddenly transformed from the Bourges king into the divinely appointed figurehead of a national crusade. Jeanne's next decisive demand was the sacred journey to Rheims. Rheims was deep in enemy territory, necessitating a rapid, daring march through lands occupied or controlled by the hostile Burgundians. The Charles and his counselors were hesitant, preferring to consolidate their gains. But Jean insisted that only a coronation at Rheims could definitively silence the slander of the Treaty of Troyes and prove his divine legitimacy. The procession was an act of faith and political genius. The French army, with Jean at its head, marched nearly 200 miles. Towns and cities, astonished by the procession's speed and Jean's reputation, opened their gates without a fight. The Burgundians, whose own power was eroding, failed to intercept them. In July 1429, the Dauphin Charles was formally crowned Charles VII, King of France, in the Cathedral of Rheims. This moment was the climax of Jean's mission and the psychological salvation of the Valois Dynasty. Charles VII's legitimacy, which had been stained by his mother's treachery and the murder of John the Fearless, was now sanctified by God and recognized by the French people. The Treaty of Troyes was, by this single act, rendered null and void in the eyes of most of France. However, the story of Jean and the king diverged immediately after the coronation. Charles VII, the shrewd politician, had used Jean's power to secure his religious and political position. But he was now a king, not a prophet's servant. He hesitated to immediately push for the conquest of Paris, preferring diplomacy with the Burgundians. Jean, frustrated by the king's cautious counselors and political maneuvering, was captured by the Burgundians in 1430. Charles VII, indebted to her for her crown, but fearing her continuing radical influence and the political complications of ransom, made only half-hearted attempts to save her. In 1431, Joan of Arc was handed over to the English, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake in Rouen. The king she had crowned did not intervene to save her. This shocking betrayal confirmed Charles VII as a cold, calculating sovereign, a king who would sacrifice a saint to secure his political position. But the miracle had been performed. The Valois Dynasty was psychologically rescued, and the French cause, under the now legitimate King Charles VII, had been restored to an offensive footing. The stage was now set for the long, pragmatic work of expelling the English entirely, and more importantly, rebuilding the centralized power the Valois uncles had so carelessly destroyed.
The coronation of Charles VII at Rheims, inspired by Joan of Arc, had secured his spiritual legitimacy, but the harsh political reality remained. France was shattered, occupied, and financially ruined. Charles VII, shedding the passivity of the Bourge king, now devoted himself to the slow, painstaking process of centralized reconstruction. He proved to be a shrewd, meticulous ruler who understood that the English could only be expelled once the Valois were fiscally and militarily superior. His strategy involved two key, deeply controversial measures: fiscal reform, instituting the taille, a permanent, professional national tax that did not require approval by the Estates General. This provided the crown with a steady, independent stream of revenue, finally freeing the Valois from the financial dependency that had crippled John II and Charles V. Military reform, using the taille revenue to create the Compagnie d'Ordonnance, ordnance companies, a standing, paid, professional royal army, eliminating the need for the unreliable, often rebellious feudal levies. These reforms were the foundation of modern French absolutism, but they directly threatened the power and income of the greatest princes of the blood, the high nobility who still viewed themselves as independent rulers rather than royal subjects. This inherent conflict between the rising power of the king and the lingering feudal rights of the aristocracy was about to erupt into a civil war, a conflict known as the Praguerie. The rebellion was instigated in 1440 by the very men who felt most entitled to power, the king's own great vassals, led by two figures of immense influence. The first was the immensely powerful Duke John II of Alençon, a prince of the blood who had been captured at Agincourt and forced to pay a ruinous ransom. He hated Charles VII's centralized policies and yearned for the return of the chaotic, decentralized power of the regencies. The second, and far more dangerous figure, was Louis, the Dauphin, the king's own heir. The Dauphin Louis, only 17, was already a figure of intense dark ambition. He despised his father, Charles VII, whom he viewed as weak and overly dependent on low-born advisors like the financier Jacques Coeur. Louis saw the Praguerie as a golden opportunity to force his father to cede him real power and dismantle the central administration that restricted the freedom of the nobility. The conspirators, Alençon, the Dauphin Louis, and various disaffected barons, met in the Bourbon territories and formalized their opposition. Their stated goal was to do good for the realm, a cynical cover for their personal greed, and force the king to sack his counselors and reverse his military and tax reforms. The Praguerie was a brief, sharp, and highly dangerous civil war. The rebels were powerful, but the key to their success lay in the participation of the Dauphin Louis, who lent the rebellion a crucial, destabilizing political legitimacy. However, the rebellion failed spectacularly due to Charles VII's new professional army. The ordnance companies, precisely the force the nobles wished to abolish,
proved their worth instantly. They were disciplined, effective, and loyal only to the king, not to local lords. Charles VII, demonstrating a new resolve he had gained since the days of the Bourge king, quickly moved his forces. The Dauphin Louis's army was routed and the rebellion collapsed. The aftermath of the Praguerie was critical for the future of the Valois. The king's mercy. Charles VII, unlike the Dauphin Charles of years past who had assassinated John the Fearless, chose clemency over execution. He pardoned most of the nobles, but fined them heavily and ensured they had no means to continue the fight. This act established the king's authority as supreme, but tempered, demonstrating that rebellion would be crushed, but not every rebel eliminated. The exiled heir. For the Dauphin Louis, Charles VII showed far less mercy. He publicly humiliated his son, removing him entirely from the royal council and sending him to govern the distant mountainous province of Dauphiné. This was not merely an assignment, it was an exile. The king trusted his ambitious, scheming son least of all. Louis, deeply wounded by his father's actions, spent the next decade in Dauphiné not as a dutiful governor, but as a king in waiting, building his own court, his own army, and his own spy network, cultivating a deep paranoia and plotting his eventual triumph. The final rupture between father and son came years later. In 1456, Charles VII, fed up with Louis's constant plotting and independent governance, sent an army to seize the Dauphin. Louis, rather than fighting his father, fled France entirely, seeking refuge at the court of the Valois' greatest enemy, Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. The Dauphin Louis, the future Spider King, now lived as a state pensioner of the man whose family his own faction had murdered on the bridge of Montereau. It was a bizarre, humiliating reversal. The direct heir of France living under the protection of the dynasty's most powerful rival. This period of exile and paranoia was the crucible that forged the ruthless, manipulative monarch who would eventually rule France. The Praguerie secured the triumph of Charles VII's reforms. The nobility had been beaten back, the crown was financially stable, and the professional army was in place. These reforms provided the stable, unified base that allowed Charles VII to resume the English War, culminating in the decisive victory at Castillon in 1453, which effectively ended the 100 Years' War and expelled the English from all of France save Calais. By 1460, Charles VII had delivered France from foreign occupation and internal feudal anarchy. He was the undisputed king of a whole modernizing nation. But the Dauphin Louis still waited in Burgundy, spinning his web, ready to seize the throne upon his father's death and replace the capable, if stern, rule of Charles VII with something far more terrifying and absolute.
The death of Charles VII, the Victorious, in 1461 was not an end, but a violent transition. The old king had spent his final years consumed by a deep paranoia, convinced that his estranged son Louis, the Dauphin, was plotting to poison him, a fear so intense it may have contributed to his final refusal to eat. When Charles VII finally succumbed, he left behind a kingdom unified, fiscally sound, and free of the English threat, but he also left a crown waiting for an heir whose character was a complete inversion of the chivalric ideal. For over 5 years, the Dauphin Louis had lived in self-imposed exile at the court of his rival, Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. Upon receiving the news of his father's death, Louis did not ride to Paris. He rode straight from Burgundy, accompanied by the Duke of Burgundy and a magnificent Burgundian escort, a deliberate and jarring display of his continued alliance with the House of Valois' greatest domestic rival. The contrast between the new king and his father was immediately evident and deeply unsettling to the old guard. Louis XI, soon to be known as the Spider King, was physically unimpressive, stooped, wiry, with a long, thin nose and sharp, darting eyes. He shunned the velvet and ermine of the royal court, preferring simple, worn cloth, often adorned with lead medallions of religious figures. He looked like a restless merchant or a cynical lawyer, not a warrior king. His coronation was perfunctory. His first act as king confirmed the worst fears of the high nobility, the same men who had participated in the Praguerie against his father. Louis XI moved with chilling speed and precision. Within weeks, Louis XI dismissed and humiliated his father's entire council. The experienced ministers, financiers, and military men who had helped Charles VII win the 100 Years' War were swept aside. He replaced them not with princes of the blood or powerful dukes, but with men of low birth, often drawn from the merchant class, the petty nobility, or obscure legal professions. These men, loyal, intelligent, and entirely dependent on the king's favor, were the tools Louis XI needed to create a government answerable to him alone. I have no need of princes who think they are kings. I need servants who understand that there is only one king in France, Louis reportedly declared. This was the core principle of Louis XI, the architect of modern France. He understood that the greatest threat to the Valois crown was no longer England, but the persistent, self-serving independence of the high French aristocracy, particularly the Dukes of Burgundy and Brétigny. His reign would be the final, ruthless phase of crushing feudalism and establishing centralized, absolute monarchy. Louis XI's methods were unprecedented for a Valois king. He was a master of political subversion, espionage, and manipulation. Where his ancestors had relied on glorious and often failed battles, Louis relied on spies and informants. He created a sprawling, efficient network of spies and intelligence agents who infiltrated the courts of his nobles, reporting every conspiracy and betrayal directly back to him. Gold over glory. He used his centralized treasury, built by his father, as a weapon. He preferred to bribe his enemies, hire mercenaries, or fund opposition parties in foreign courts, rather than engage his own troops in costly, glorious, and unpredictable warfare. The power of the law. He systematically eroded feudal power by reviving and enforcing ancient royal rights, making the king's justice and laws paramount throughout the realm. His most immediate and dangerous rival was Charles the Bold, the new Duke of Burgundy, who succeeded his father, Philip the Good, shortly after Louis's ascension. Charles the Bold was everything Louis was not, a classic, bombastic feudal prince obsessed with chivalry, military glory, and the dream of carving out a new independent Middle Kingdom between France and Germany. Louis and Charles, both the same age, were destined for a conflict that would determine whether France remained a unified nation under the Valois or devolved into a collection of powerful, independent dukedoms. The high nobility, led by the Duke of Brétigny and the Duke of Berry, Louis's own brother, saw their opportunity in Charles the Bold. They formed a powerful coalition to resist Louis's centralizing efforts, calling themselves the League of the Public Weal, a name as cynical as the Praguerie that preceded it. They claimed they fought for the good of the people, but their true aim was to roll back the Valois' power and return to feudal independence. The stage was set for the defining conflict of Louis XI's reign, the showdown between the modern, scheming, centralized king and the powerful, romantic, but outdated feudal nobility. Louis XI, the Spider King, was ready to meet the challenge, not with a sword, but with his web.
The moment of confrontation for Louis XI, the Spider King, came swiftly after his chaotic succession. The high nobility, sensing a weakness in the new king who preferred low-born advisors and political maneuvering over chivalric display, rallied under the banner of the League of the Public Weal. Their aim was to force Louis to return to the decentralized feudal structure of the past, to put the king back in his iron cage. The heart of the League was a triumvirate of powerful, dangerous men. Charles the Bold, Count of Charolais, soon to be Duke of Burgundy,
the king's greatest and most bombastic rival, Francis II, Duke of Brittany, who sought full independence from the French crown, and Charles of France, Duke of Berry, the king's own younger brother, who demanded greater appanage, land and authority, and served as the League's royal figurehead. The League mustered an immense feudal army, a force large enough to capture Paris, and marched toward the capital. Louis XI, caught off guard by the speed and scale of the mobilization, realized he could not simply bribe or scheme his way out of this existential threat. He had to engage in a battle that would either destroy his nascent centralized monarchy or cement his authority. The two armies clashed on July 16, 1465, near the village of Montlhéry, just south of Paris. The battle itself was a masterpiece of feudal ineptitude and royal pragmatism. Louis XI, no general, fought bravely but desperately, even leading a charge that nearly resulted in his capture. He received a painful wound and was only saved by the courage of his personal guard. The feudal nobility on both sides, driven by personal honor rather than military objective, often broke ranks to pursue individual skirmishes or plunder, abandoning the main battle. At one point, entire wings of both the Burgundian and French armies were convinced they had lost, fleeing the field in panic. The French right flank completely collapsed, and a number of Louis's men, assuming defeat, rode back to Paris, spreading the news that the king was dead. Charles the Bold performed slightly better, fighting with his characteristic ferocious bravery, but failing to capitalize on the confusion. By dusk, the battle was an utter mess. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, and neither could claim a clear military victory. Louis XI, seeing the exhaustion of his men and the danger of his position, performed the first great piece of political maneuvering of the campaign. He ordered a swift, calculated retreat toward the nearby defensible town of Corbeil, leaving the field to the Burgundians. Charles the Bold, believing he had won a glorious victory simply by remaining on the field, settled down to lick his wounds. The true genius of Louis XI, however, was revealed in the days immediately following the battle. While Charles the Bold spent his time glorifying his dubious victory, Louis XI was already maneuvering. He did not retreat to a safe fortress. Instead, he rode directly into Paris. The gates were closed, and the citizens, hearing the panicked reports of his death, were ready to revolt. Louis, wounded but alive, rode through the streets, addressing the populace directly. He charmed the burghers, praised their loyalty, and immediately set about fortifying the city and arranging for massive food and supply shipments. He had learned from the Étienne Marcel incident the key to France was the loyalty of the capital's common people, not the honor of the nobility. When Charles the Bold and the League finally arrived at the walls of Paris, they found a city that was fortified, well-provisioned, and loyal to the king. The high nobility, despite their superior numbers, dared not attempt a long, costly siege against a united capital and its determined king. Louis XI had lost the tactical battle, but won the strategic war. He refused to be cornered into a decisive military victory, choosing instead the political victory. He entered into immediate, intense negotiations with the League. The resulting peace treaty was another masterstroke of Louis's manipulative genius. He granted the rebels virtually every demand on paper: land, titles, and money. He gave his ambitious brother, Charles, the vast territory of Normandy and heaped concessions upon the Duke of Brittany and Charles the Bold. The League dispersed, believing they had humbled the king and won their feudal privileges. But Louis XI had no intention of honoring these treaties. He viewed them as temporary political instruments, purchased with paper, to dissolve the immediate threat. He had dismantled the coalition without a costly military victory. Once the dukes had retreated to their respective domains,
Louis XI began slowly and methodically to reclaim every concession he had made. He used legal maneuvering, the power of his loyal parliament, the Parlement, spies, and bribes to strip Charles of France of Normandy within the year, returning it to the crown. He used the same relentless, patient pressure against the Duke of Brétigny. The Battle of Montlhéry was the defining moment of the Spider King's method. It showed a king who was willing to fight when necessary, but who preferred to win by cunning rather than courage. He was the anti-chivalric king, who would lie, bribe, and subvert to ensure the unity of France under absolute Valois authority. Having politically survived his own nobility, his gaze now turned entirely toward the final, crushing of his ultimate rival, Charles the Bold of Burgundy.
The decade following the failed rebellion of the public weal was dedicated by Louis XI, the Spider King, to a single, relentless objective: the destruction of Charles the Bold and the incorporation of Burgundy into the French crown. Louis understood that if the Valois were to achieve true absolute power, they had to eliminate the greatest remaining feudal challenge. Louis achieved this not through direct confrontation, but through a brilliant, slow campaign of economic warfare, diplomatic subversion, and espionage. While Charles the Bold spent his time and vast fortune pursuing grand, unrealistic schemes, dreaming of becoming a king in his own right, and conquering territories in Germany and Switzerland, Louis systematically isolated him. Louis XI secretly funded Charles the Bold's enemies, primarily the highly effective Swiss pikemen, who were the new face of military power in Europe. Louis then sat back and watched as Charles the Bold, driven by his own bombastic chivalry, marched his forces to repeated, disastrous defeats. The climax of this long game came in 1477. In a final, desperate battle against the Swiss at Nancy, Charles the Bold was killed. His body was found stripped and half frozen in a muddy ditch, a humiliating and ignoble end for the last great feudal prince. Louis XI seized the moment with brutal efficiency. Charles the Bold's only heir was his young daughter, Mary of Burgundy. Ignoring her rights and the feudal obligations of his kingdom, Louis immediately annexed the vast core territories of the Duchy of Burgundy to the French crown. This final acquisition made the Valois kingdom geographically whole and permanently removed the greatest domestic threat to royal power. By the 1480s, Louis XI had realized the ultimate dream of the Valois dynasty. He was the undisputed master of a centralized, unified, and financially powerful France. The English were reduced to holding only Calais. The great dukes had been humbled or eliminated, and the new professional army and permanent tax system ensured the crown's perpetual supremacy. But this triumph was purchased at a terrible personal cost. The king who had destroyed his enemies through cunning was now a prisoner of his own paranoia. The final years of his reign were spent in voluntary isolation at the Château de Plessis-les-Tours, a fortified residence Louis had transformed into an iron cage. The chateau was surrounded by watchtowers and ditches. He had the grounds bristling with man-traps and patrolled by archers from Scotland, whom he trusted more than his own French subjects. No one could approach the king without passing through multiple security checkpoints, guarded by men personally vetted by Louis. The king, who had destroyed his enemies through cunning, was now consumed by the fear of death and the fear of betrayal. Louis XI, in his private prison, was a caricature of the absolute monarch. He was constantly consulting astrologers, soliciting relics from distant monasteries, and demanding visits from hermits and holy men, all in a desperate attempt to bargain with God for more time. The only man who retained constant access to the king was his physician, Jacques Courtier, whom he constantly threatened but was too terrified to dismiss, believing only Courtier could keep him alive. The relationship between the king and his estranged heir, Charles, the future Charles VIII, remained one of deep suspicion. Louis, remembering his own rebellious youth, the Praguerie, chapter 9, ensured his son was kept almost entirely ignorant of state affairs, deliberately raising him with little practical knowledge, hoping to neuter his potential for rebellion. As his final illness progressed, Louis XI became more erratic and reclusive. He ordered increasingly eccentric measures to project an image of vigor. Dressing more lavishly than ever before, in stark contrast to his usual simple clothing, importing exotic animals, and staging elaborate hunts that he was too weak to attend. This was the final, desperate gambit of the Spider King: to deceive death itself by maintaining the illusion of power. The great House of Valois, which had started in Chapter 1 with a king captured by foreign arms, concluded its second great phase with a king captured by his own mind. The feudal battlefield tragedy of the 100 Years' War was replaced by the modern psychological despotism of the absolute monarchy. Louis XI died at Plessis-les-Tours in August 1483. His resolution of the Valois historical arc was profound. The end of feudal anarchy, he had completed the work started by Charles V and Charles VII, cementing the crown's control over the nobility and creating a centralized national state. The legacy of the Spider: he established a blueprint for royal governance based on intelligence, finance, law, and ruthless pragmatism, a model that would define French monarchy for centuries. The series concludes not with a glorious triumph, but with a dark, inevitable finality. The Valois had saved France from the English, but they had done so by trading medieval chivalry for modern tyranny. Louis XI left the French crown secure, unified, and overwhelmingly powerful, but also deeply feared. The legacy perfectly embodied by the man who died alone in his iron cage, the architect of modern France, and the last of the great Valois kings.